Hello, welcome to CWI Part B Practical Book of Specification Lecture 11. In this lecture, I'm gonna give a lecture about Chapter 3. And last time we stopped it here. 3.1.9.7 Word Repair and Inspection Procedure. So today, I'm going to give a lecture about 3.2 Visual Inspection Acceptance Criteria for Pipelne. I'm going to read out the specification sentence and give you the explanation and give you the examples and photos. 3.2.1 Inadequate penetration without high-low, which is called IP. Abbreviation is IP, inadequate penetration. And here it says inadequate penetration without high-low is defined as the incomplete filling of the word root. This condition is shown schematically in Figure C. Figure C is here. So incomplete filling of the root bit here. Nothing is here, nothing filled. Without the welding, bonding, fusion, and IP inadequate penetration should be considered a defect should any of the following conditions exist. 3.2.1.1 Condition number 1. The length of an individual indication of IP exceeds 25 mm. Individual IP exceeds 25 mm. That's reject. 3.2.1.2 Condition number 2. The aggregate length of indication of IP in any continuous 300 mm length of word exceeds 25 mm. So aggregate length IP in 300 continuous word exceeds again 25 mm. This is reject. Exceeds 25 mm aggregate length also reject. 3.2.1.3 Condition number 3. The aggregate length of indication of IP exceeds 8% of the word length in any wordless word less than 300 mm in length. Aggregate length of IP exceeds 8% in any word less than 300 mm length. So for example, here we have a pipeline weld, and IP is not able to be figured out here outside of the surface but inside the surface. But I don't have the picture of the inside of this pipeline weld photo, so I just say here inside of the pipeline I have a IP like this. Condition number 2. Okay, let's just go to condition number 1. IP 3.2.1.1. IP individual IP exceeds 25 mm. So individual IP number 1 IP exceeds 25 mm. This is reject. And condition number 2. In any continuous 300 mm length, the aggregate length, which means IP number 1. And let's say this is 10 mm. And here to here, the length of total word length is 300 mm. And here another IP here, and the length of this IP is 10. And unfortunately another IP here, and the length of this one is again 10 mm. Then aggregate length of the word in 300 continuous word. Number 1 IP, number 2 IP, IP number 3. Total length of the all IPs. This, sum of these three is 300 millimeter. This is exceeding 25 millimeter, so this is reject. This is condition number 2, which is explained 3.2.1.2. And condition number 3, 3.2.1.3, less than 300 millimeter. So here to here, assuming distance here to there is 200 millimeter. And IP number 1 here is 10 millimeter. And IP number 2 is here. This is 8 millimeter. So aggregate lengths of IPs 1, 2. Sum of these two is 18 millimeter. But the condition here it says 8% of the word length. So 200 times 8%, which is 200 times 0.08, which is 16 millimeter. So aggregate length of IP is more than 16 millimeter, which is 18 millimeter. So this is reject as well. This is how you calculate length of the IP and how you reject and accept the IP. And I'm gonna show you the RT, the film photo of the IP. This kind of effect here is bottom line word, top word, and between here nothing filled. If you go to API 11.0 1104 11.4, this picture here shown is kind of ICP, inadequate or incomplete cross penetration, but it's kind of IP, inadequate penetration. And if you radiograph it, then RT film shows like this. Here nothing, no filling. This is IP. And 3.2.2 inadequate penetration due to high-low, IPD. Inadequate penetration due to high-low, inadequate penetration, IP, but due to high-low is defined as the condition that exists when one edge of the root is exposed, something like here. One edge of the root is exposed or unbonded because adjacent pipe or fitting joints are misaligned. Result of the misaligned, IP is created, and this is called IP due to high-low. This condition is shown schematically in figure D. This is figure D. IPD shall be considered a defect should any of the following condition exist. So IPD is the picture of the IPD of the radiograph film, something like this. Here, due to misalignment, one edge is exposed to the surface, to the air, and no filling here, so the RT film shows like this. This is IPD, and the rejection criteria, acceptance criteria of the IPD is 3.2.2.1. The length of individual indication of IPD, individual IPD exceeds 50 millimeter. So if the length of this over 50 millimeter, this is reject. 3.2.2.2, the aggregate length of indication of IPD in any continuous 300 mm length of the word exceeds 75 mm. So in 300 mm of continuous word, you have IPD number 1, IPD number 2, IPD number 3 here. And sum of these lengths of IPD is over 75 mm. That's reject. This is 3.2.2. 3.2.3, incomplete diffusion. Incomplete diffusion is defined as a surface imperfection between the word matter and the base matter that is open to the surface. This condition is shown schematically in figure E. This is figure E, and this area, the black line, here is the open surface. And IF, incomplete diffusion, should be considered a defect should any of the following conditions exist. 3.2.3.1, the length of an individual indication of IF exceeds 25 mm. So IF looks like here. This is incomplete diffusion on the side wall, and artifilm looks like here. Incomplete filling here, 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 here. This is incomplete sidewall diffusion, and this is reject when the aggregate length of length of individual indication of IF exceeds 25 mm. So length of each of the IF, just one individual IF, is over 25 mm. That's reject. And 3.2.3.2, the aggregate length of indication of IF in any continuous 300 mm length of the word exceeds 25 mm. So each of the lengths of the indication of IF is over 25 mm in 300 continuous word over 25 mm. That's reject. And 3.2.3.3, the aggregate length of indication of IF exceeds 8% of word length in any word less than 300 mm. So this is 200 mm, and some of the lengths of this IF exceed 8%, which is 16 mm. Then this is reject. So just saying, assuming the length of the total IF is over 18 mm, then this is reject because it's over 16 mm. That's 3.2.3.3 IF. And 3.2.4, bond through BT, abbreviation is BT for the bond through. A bond through is defined as a portion of the root bead where excessive penetration has caused the word plural to blow into the pipes, resulting in a hole or a depression in the root bead of a single groove word. BT should be considered the defect should any of the following conditions exist. So BT is portion of a root bead. Here is no schematic picture, so I'm going to show you the schematic picture of the BT. This is BT. So in the root bead, excessive penetration has caused the word powder to blow into the pipe, resulting in a hole. So resulting in a hole, so nothing is here as a hole, completely empty. Or depression in the root bead of a single groove word. So this is single groove word, and depression, kind of depression. This is just a complete hole, but depression can be a bond through. And when you see the RT film bond through, looks like this, empty spots, bond through, holes. This is bond through, and bond through is reject when 3.2.4.1, the maximum dimension exceeds 36 millimeter. So if this dimension exceeds over 6 millimeter, this is reject. 3.2.4.2, the sum of dimension of a separate BTs exceeds 13 millimeter in any continuous 300 millimeter length, a word or total word length, whichever is less. Sum of total, which means aggregate length of the separate BTs exceeds 13 millimeter in any continuous 300 millimeter. So this is 300 millimeter, and dimension of total bond through, sum of this bond through over 13 millimeter, then this is reject. This was bond through. And 3.2.5, porosity. Porosity is defined as gas trapped by solidifying word matter before the gas has a chance to rise to surface of the mortal portal and escape. So during after welding, here is a gas trapped in the wordment, and after welding, gas has a chance to rise to the top of the surface of the word, and if it rise and escape from the wordment, then during the welding, if the gas trapped gas escapes from the wordment to the top surface of the word, then that's not a porosity. But after welding, the trapped gas just goes up and arises to the top of the surface and escape, and here is a hole. Holes occur, then that's porosity. Porosity is generally spherical, but may be elongated or irregular in shapes, such as piping wormhole porosity. Porosity shall be considered the defect should any of the following conditions exist. So porosity looks like this. Inside of the wordment, many holes, small, tiny holes exist. If you shoot the RT, the film shows like this. Something like wormhole and cluster holes. So the definition of this picture is cluster porosity. And porosity is reject when 3.2.5.1, the size of individual pore exceeds 3 millimeter. So just individual pore exceeds 3 millimeter, then this is reject. And 3.2.5.2, the size of individual pore exceeds 25% of thinner of the nominal word thickness joint. So again, this picture. Here is thickness of this base metal is 30 millimeter, and this one, to calculate easily thickness of, no, this is not an easy calculation. Let's say this is 100 millimeter and this is 150. Then acceptance criteria for the porosity in different thickness section based on 25% of the thinner section. Like here it says thinner of the nominal word thickness 25%. So the thick 25% is 25 millimeter, and 25 millimeter is very big porosity. Individual pore exceeds 25% of thinner nominal wall thickness. So the porosity like here and exceeds to 25 millimeter, which is 100 millimeter thinner section of the 8%. Then this is reject. 3.2.5.3 cluster porosity that occurs in the finished pass should be considered the defect should any of the following condition exist. So this cluster porosity, this is the cluster porosity on the top surface, and this is reject when the diameter of cluster exceeds 13 millimeter. So diameter of the cluster exceeds 13 millimeter. This is reject. And 3.2.5.3.2, the aggregate length of CP in any continuous 300 millimeter length word exceeds 13 millimeter. So cluster number 1, cluster number 2, and cluster number 3, and sum of the dimension of clusters. Cluster porosities exceeds 13 millimeter in 300 continuous word. Number 1, number 2, number 3, sum of these lengths of the cluster porosity over 13 millimeter. That's reject. And 3.2.6 cracks. Crack shall be considered a defect. Crack, if you see the crack in word want, wherever and whichever and whatever, that's reject. 3.2.7 external undercutting, EU, or internal undercutting, IU. Undercutting is defined as a groove melted or any reduction of parent material adjacent to the toe or root or weld end left unfilled by weld metal. Undercutting adjacent to the cover pass EU or root pass IU shall be considered the defect should the maximum dimension of table 4 exceeded. So undercut is defined as thickness reduction and the base metal where very adjacent to the word toe. So this is external reinforcement, and if you have a thickness reduction like here and here, this is external undercut. So EU, external undercut, and this is internal reinforcement, and if you have an undercut thickness reduction, at the toe and between the word toe and base metal, here thickness reduction, this is undercut. Same here at the toe, between toe and base metal, if you have a thickness reduction, this is undercut, and this is called internal undercut, IU. And this EU or IU are reject when table 4 are exceeded. So this is condition number 1, condition number 2, condition number 3. Depth of the undercut and length of undercut. When depth of undercut is equal to or less than and less than 0.4 millimeter or 6% of pipe wall thickness, whichever is smaller, which means depth of undercut is equal to or less than 0.4 millimeter, or let's say the base metal thickness is 10 millimeter. then the acceptance criteria is 6%. 6% is 0.6 10 millimeter times 0.06 is 0.6 millimeter. Depth of undercut is 0.6 millimeter over 0.6 millimeter. This is reject. And the length condition acceptable regardless of length. Length is, if undercut here between where the toe and base metal, if you have a thickness reduction, and length of this undercut, but this condition number 1 here acceptable regardless of length. So regardless of length, this undercut length, this is acceptable. If undercut is less than 0.4 millimeter, equal to or and less than 0.4 millimeter or 6% of the thickness, and regardless of the length of undercut, this is acceptable. So condition number 1 is length is acceptable, and condition number 2, over 0.4 millimeter but equal to and less than 0.8 millimeter or 6% but less than 12.5 of pipe wall thickness, whichever is smaller. So same thing applies here. The depth of undercut is over 0.4 millimeter but less than, where is the 0.8 millimeter, equal to and less than 0.8 millimeter. This, if undercut depth of undercut is over this is reject. And here again 10 millimeter thickness and over 6% but 12.5%. 6% is 0.6 millimeter when thickness is 10 millimeter, and 12.5 is 1.25 millimeter. If depth of the undercut is more than 0.6 millimeter and 1.25 millimeter, then this undercut is reject. A length condition is 50 millimeter in continuous 300 millimeter length. So here depth of undercut in 300 continuous word length. That length of the undercut is more than 50 millimeter in 300 total length of the word, then it's reject. Or 1/6 the word length, whichever is smaller. So you just select it's a smaller one. So let's say total weld length is 100 millimeter. Then 1/6 of 100 millimeter is I don't have the calculator now, so I'm gonna show calculator here, times 6, which is 16.6. 100 times 6 is 1/6 is 16.6 millimeter. So this is smaller, so do not take select this 50 millimeter, but take this 16.6 millimeter as acceptance criteria. This is condition. This was condition number 2, and condition number 3 is depth of undercut is over 0.8 millimeter or 12.5% of the word thickness, whichever is smaller. So select the smaller value. And length is not acceptable. If the depth is over 0.8 millimeter and 12.5% of the word thickness, then this is rejected, regardless of the length of undercut. Reject. And here, if the undercut, depth of the undercut is over 0.8 millimeter, or when this is 100 millimeter thickness, over 100, not 100, over 0.8 millimeter and 12.5%, which is 1.25. No, this is not 1.25. Word thickness times 12.5 is 12.5 is 1.25. Oh, what's wrong with me? I cannot do the calculation. I'm going to use the .5. So if undercut depth is 12.5, this is projectable. So take the smaller one, so over 0.8 millimeter. And regardless of the length, undercut is acceptable. And 3.2.8, accumulation of imperfection AI, excluding IPD, EU, and IU. Any accumulation of otherwise acceptable imperfections such as porosity, cluster porosity, incomplete fusion, IP is inadequate penetration, and bond through should be considered a defect should any of the following conditions exist. The aggregate length of AI, accumulation of imperfection in any continuous 300 mm length of word exceeds 50 mm. The aggregate length of AI exceeds 8% of the word length. This is rejected. And here, up to this 3.2.8, this is chapter 3, workmanship requirements and visual inspection acceptance criteria for pipeline. And 3.2 is visual inspection acceptance criteria. Before I finish my lecture, I'm going to show you the actual questions. 3.2.1, inadequate penetration without high-low. In the CWI Part B actual question, only this inadequate penetration without high-low IP is coming up. And the picture of the IP is like, where is it? I cannot find it. Oh. IP, this IP looks like in the actual pipe specimen, IP looks like here. Here is a back bit. You can see the back bit, but here you're not able to see the back bit. And again, here no back bit, here no back bit. So number 1, IP number 1, here IP number 2, IP number 3. So you just measure. This is not IP. This is not IP. Here IP number 3. So measure the sum of the IP number 1, 2, 3. If this exceeds 25 mm, this is reject. Only this kind of question as in the CWI Part B actual question. Okay, I'm gonna stop here today. Thank you for listening to my lecture. I see you next time.